The 9965th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Latvia, Poland, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Miroslav Jancha, Assistant Secretary General for Europe, Central Asia, and Americas, Departments of Political and Peace Building Affairs and Peace Operations. And Ms. Joyce Masuya, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Miroslav Jancha.
Briefed the Security Council on the situation in Ukraine last time a little more than a month ago. Since then, the daily barrage of Russian missiles and drones against Ukrainian cities and towns has continued to intensify with devastating consequences for the civilian population. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, in June, civilian casualties in Ukraine reached a 3-year high. In the first half of the year alone, 6,754 civilians were killed or injured. According to Ukrainian authorities, so far in July, the Russian Federation has launched at least 5,183 long-range munitions against Ukraine, including a record number of 728 long-range drones on 9 July. In recent weeks, the capital city of Kyiv and the historic port city of Odessa have been especially heavily impacted by the daily attacks involving massive swarms of hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles. And while frontline areas of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Sumy, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Donetsk regions of Ukraine remain particularly dangerous for civilians, nowhere is safe in Ukraine. Over the last few weeks, civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure have also been reported in western Ukrainian regions of Lviv, Volyn, Chernivtsi, as well as in Lutsk and Ivano-Frankivsk, with the last two cities reportedly experiencing their heaviest aerial attacks of the war. Across the country, attacks have struck hospitals, schools, energy and transport infrastructure, and residential buildings. On 21st July, a massive Russian aerial strike on Kiev reportedly caused damage to a metro station where hundreds were seeking shelter. The same attack reportedly set a kindergarten on fire and damaged a multi-story residential building, resulting in dozens of civilian casualties. On 11 July, Russian drones hit the city center of Kharkiv, reportedly damaging a maternity ward at the country's second largest hospital, forcing mothers with newborns to flee. On 24 June, a countrywide Russian drone and missile attack reportedly struck a passenger train and damaged more than 40 schools and kindergartens, a cathedral, 8 medical centers and hospitals, and several residential buildings. At least 21 people were reportedly killed and more than 300 injured. The same devastating scene was repeated during another record-level attack across Ukraine on 29 June. In total, since the beginning of the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, OHCHR has verified that at least 13,580 civilians, including 716 children, have been killed. 34,115 civilians, including 2,173 children, have been injured. My colleague, Assistant Secretary General Joyce Msuya of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, will provide updates about the impacts of the escalating attacks on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Mr. President, we are also concerned about the increasing number of reported civilian casualties reportedly resulting from Ukrainian drone attacks inside the Russian Federation. According to Russian officials, Ukrainian drone attacks in recent weeks have led to civilian casualties in the Belgorod, Kursk, Bryansk, Voronezh, Kaluga, Lipetsk, and Tula regions of the Russian Federation. Moscow and St. Petersburg have also been targeted with dozens of drones, reportedly causing severe disruptions to air traffic. Following one such recent series of attacks between 5 and 7 July, over 2,000 flights were reportedly disrupted in multiple Russian airports, including in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Nizhny Novgorod. The United Nations, however, is not in a position to verify these reported incidents in the Russian Federation, including any reports of civilian casualties. International law clearly prohibits attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. We strongly condemn all such attacks, wherever they occur. They must end immediately. Mr. President, the intensified aerial attacks and fighting on the ground continue to pose a significant threat to the safety and security of Ukraine's nuclear sites. On 11 July, a drone attack reportedly hit the city hall in Enerhodar, where most of the staff of Ukraine's Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, ZNPP, live, located only about 5 kilometers from the plant. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, the reported drone attack followed reports of an overnight shooting incident near the ZNPP on 12 July. On 4 July, IAEA raised concerns over the reported loss by ZNPP of all its off-site power for several hours. Meanwhile, Ukraine's operating nuclear power plants, Khmelnytsky, Rivne, and South Ukraine, also regularly report of drones being detected near the sites. These latest incidents underline the fragility of nuclear safety and security during the war and the need to ensure sustained attention to this issue. We continue to urge the sides to act responsibly. Any nuclear incident must be avoided at all costs. Mr. President, already at the end of last year, the total cost of reconstruction and recovery in Ukraine was assessed at $524 billion over the next decade. The most recent escalation of attacks is quickly adding to this toll. In this regard, this year's Ukraine Recovery Conference that took place in Rome earlier this month represented a significant milestone in the international community's commitment to supporting Ukraine's long-term reconstruction. The event culminated in over 11 billion US dollars in pledged funding. Speaking on behalf of the Secretary General, acting UNDP Administrator Hao Liang-shu reaffirmed the UN's commitment to supporting Ukraine to rebuild stronger, from advancing green energy and mine action to supporting community resilience. It is crucial that the international solidarity with Ukraine is sustained as the country embarks on its long journey for recovery. Mr. President, on Wednesday, Ukrainian and Russian delegations met in Istanbul for the third time this year. We welcome the continuation of these direct contacts between the sides and urge Ukraine and the Russian Federation to make further progress towards a ceasefire and a lasting settlement. We are grateful for the meaningful efforts of Turkey, the United States, and other relevant actors to help sustain the necessary diplomatic momentum. We commend in particular the reported progress made in the humanitarian track of these talks, including with regards to exchanges of prisoners and of war and civilian detainees. Since last May, following the first two rounds of negotiations in Istanbul, the Russian Federation and Ukraine have already reportedly exchanged hundreds of prisoners of war, including those badly injured, as well as more than 7,000 mortal remains. Each such exchange and repatriation alleviates the pain of the affected families and serves as a reminder that diplomacy can work. We therefore call on the sides to continue such exchanges. Mr. President, on Tuesday, this Council unanimously adopted a resolution reiterating that all states shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means through dialogue, diplomatic engagement, and cooperation in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. The resolution also underscored the importance of the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women and meaningful participation of youth in dispute resolution efforts. As the Secretary General stated during that meeting, diplomacy may not have always succeeded in preventing conflicts, violence, and instability, but it still holds the power to stop them. With this in mind, and recalling the Security Council Resolution 2774 of 2025, adopted in February, it is crucial that the momentum of the ongoing diplomatic contacts is not only sustained, but reinforced by genuine political will to make tangible progress towards ending the current dangerous cycle of escalation as soon as possible. The heartbreaking and rising human toll of the past nearly 3.5 years of war underscores the urgency of a complete, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire as the first step towards a just and lasting peace. A peace that is in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant UN resolutions, and that respects the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We remain ready to support all meaningful efforts to this end. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Jancha for his briefing. I now give the floor to Madame Joyce Msuya.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council once again on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, along with Assistant Secretary General Jenka. Since our last update to this Council on 20 June, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine has continued to deteriorate sharply. Over the past week, renewed waves of missile and drone strikes have devastated lives and infrastructure across multiple regions, as already outlined by Assistant Secretary General Jenka. According to the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, the scale and speed of civilian harm remain alarmingly high. In the first half of 2025, nearly 50% more civilian casualties were recorded compared to the same period last year. Over the past day, authorities report strikes on urban centers, including Cherkasy, Kharkiv, and Odessa, killed 5 civilians and injured 93, among them 11 children, as hostilities intensify nationwide. Last weekend, attacks struck populated areas in Dnipro, Kharkiv, and Sumy, reportedly killing dozens of people and injuring more than 70, including children. In Kharkiv, a rehabilitation center for people with disabilities was hit. In Kiev, a kindergarten, a metro station, shops, and residential buildings were damaged. In the Ivano-Frankivsk region, once seen as a refuge far from the front lines and home to many displaced families, we saw the largest attack there since the war escalated in 2022. There is no safe place left in Ukraine. These are the latest in a series of attacks that have brought even more fear and suffering to communities, both near the front lines and far from them. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas, including long-range missiles and drones, remains a key driver of civilian harm. Mr. President, civilians in Ukraine continue to bear the heaviest burden, struggling to access food, water, power, and healthcare. Nearly 13 million people need assistance, but limited funding means we can reach only a fraction of them. For many displaced women and girls, safety remains out of reach. Risks of violence at home, in shelters, and during evacuations continue. Yet the local women-led groups best placed to help are scaling back due to funding shortfalls, leaving countless women without the protection they so urgently need. Displacement from frontline areas continue to rise. Since April, more than 26,000 people fleeing hostilities have registered at transit centers. In response, our partners are working with authorities to open new sites in the Sumy and Dnipro regions to meet rising needs. Across Ukraine, 3.7 million people remain displaced, with nearly 6 million refugees abroad. Additionally, unverified reports in recent days and weeks indicate civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure in the regions of Kursk, Bryansk, Belgorod, Voronezh, Kaluga, Lipetsk, and Tula regions in the Russian Federation. Under international humanitarian law, all parties must take all feasible precautions to avoid and minimize civilian harm. Mr. President, the continued use of anti-personnel mines puts civilian lives and livelihoods at risk every day. The Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention strictly prohibits their use. Under this convention, states have agreed that the harm caused by these weapons is unacceptable and that considerations of humanity must impose limits on their use. We cannot go back. This is why we note with alarm the recent decree by the Ukrainian president announcing Ukraine's withdrawal from the convention. This follows the regrettable decisions of neighboring countries to withdraw from this convention. Assertions of exceptional threats and military necessity cannot outweigh international humanitarian law, which seeks to limit human suffering precisely when a state is fighting against its enemy. The Secretary General has urged all states to adhere to humanitarian disarmament treaties and immediately halt any steps towards their withdrawal. Mr. President, despite relentless risks, our humanitarian partners in Ukraine continue their vital work, reaching more than 3.6 million people with emergency health care, shelter, clean water, and cash to families since January. But access remains precarious. In regions such as Kherson and Donetsk, intensified fighting has forced aid convoys to be delayed or suspended, putting humanitarian workers at risk and interrupting life-saving support. We remain committed to ensuring all necessary arrangements are in place to reach people in need safely and without obstruction. Our ability to reach an estimated 1.5 million civilians in areas under the control of the Russian Federation, including parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, remains extremely limited and increasingly difficult. It is not for lack of capacity or will, but rather persistent access impediments that prevent us from getting help to those who need it most. At the same time, we urgently need the resources to sustain and expand efforts where we have access. International humanitarian law could not be clearer. All parties must allow safe, rapid, and unimpeded access to civilians in need, no matter where they are or who controls the territory. Mr. President, despite the growing scale of needs, funding remains critically low. Just 34% of the $2.6 billion required for the 2025 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan has been received, forcing cuts to vital programs just as needs are soaring. Cash assistance, mental health support, and services to respond to gender-based violence have been slashed due to funding shortfalls. Without an immediate influx of resources, even prioritized programs will be at risk, just as the people of Ukraine approach a fourth wartime winter. Last week, the United Nations and our humanitarian partners launched the 2025-2026 Winter Response Plan, which aims to reach 1.7 million people with heating support, winter clothing, shelter repairs, emergency energy solutions, and cash. The plan prioritizes households in frontline and collective sites where freezing temperatures could turn already dire conditions into deadly ones. We urge member states to act now so that emergency supplies are in place before winter hits and conditions make it far harder to reach those in need. Mr. President, allow me to close with 3 urgent messages to this Council. First, civilians and civilian objects must be protected. The scale of civilian death and injury and the destruction to homes, schools, hospitals, and displacement centers must stop. Disproportionate and other indiscriminate attacks are strictly prohibited. Second, ensure humanitarian access. All parties must facilitate safe, rapid, and unimpeded access to civilians in need wherever they are. The Council and all member states must exert their influence to ensure civilians are protected and humanitarians can reach those in need. Third, support the response. Ukrainians cannot afford delays or donor fatigue. Every contribution counts. Mr. President, this war continues to inflict suffering on a staggering scale. The trauma is daily, the destruction is widespread, and the resilience of civilians is being pushed to its limits. But our commitment to assist them must not waver. Thank you.
I thank ASG Masuya for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And to begin with, I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Masuya and Assistant Secretary General Jenča for their insight and contribution to today's discussion. And I welcome representative of Ukraine in the chamber. Mr. President, today's briefings painted a comprehensive picture of the latest developments on the ground, and the picture is grim. Civilian casualties are on the rise. Homes, schools, and hospitals continue to be destroyed. To top it all, there is no end in sight to all the death and suffering. Since the beginning of the year, Russia has been escalating its aggression. By March, Russia was launching more than 1,000 drones and missiles per week, terrorizing Ukrainians in their homes and shelters night after night. This month, the attacks have been particularly destructive. They culminated on the 9th of July, when Russia launched its largest ever aerial attack, using more than 700 drones and missiles. This vividly illustrates the accelerating pace of the escalation. This month alone, Russia has launched more than 5,000 drones and missiles. The ramped-up aerial attacks have a devastating impact on the civilian population, as we heard. As the briefers pointed out, the numbers of civilians killed or injured have been rising sharply in the first half of 2025. In fact, June was the deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians in 3 years. In addition to all this, civilians across Ukraine are each day exposed to arbitrary detentions, torture, executions, and sexual violence. These acts are an obvious violation of international humanitarian law. Slovenia condemns the aggression and the latest escalatory steps, Mr. President. Slovenia welcomes all diplomatic efforts toward a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, including the latest meeting between the two countries held last Wednesday. We welcome the agreement on the POW exchange in this regard. However, the outcomes of both previous and recent talks remain insufficient. Instead of genuine peace talks, we are witnessing a surge in drone production. Instead of respect for international law, more and more armaments are being procured, including from countries under UN sanctions. Instead of reuniting families, Ukrainian children remain displaced and these continue to burn. Mr. President, we are in a desperate need of a change of pace. We need action to prevent further civilian deaths and finally make a decisive step on the path to peace, as implored by this Council last February. For months, we have listened to pleas of members of this Council for ceasefire. To little avail. Enough time has passed. This Council needs to act. We need a ceasefire resolution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary Yencha and Assistant Secretary General Masuya for their briefings. Colleagues, we are once again gathered in this chamber to address Russia's ongoing illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, a war that continues to escalate in intensity as the Russian Federation persists in its aggression against its sovereign neighbor with increased ferocity. Mr. President, allow me to make 3 key points. First, in recent weeks, we have witnessed the most severe attacks against civilians across Ukraine in over 3 years. A relentless and sustained Russian blitz of drones, missiles, and bombs has inflicted death, destruction, and despair. Kyiv has been subjected to intense overnight missile and drone attacks. Since then, several other regions, including Dnipro, Kharkiv, Kherson, Odessa, Sumy, and Vinnytsia, also came under heavy attack. Deliberate assaults continue to be launched against civilian targets, from residential blocks and hospitals to shopping centers and other critical infrastructure. Nowhere is safe for Ukraine's civilians. In the last week alone, at least 20 civilians have been killed and more than 100 injured, including several children. Russia's claim that its armed forces only attack military targets is nothing more than this distortion of the truth. The reality on the ground tells a different story, as we also just heard from Assistant Secretary General Masuya. This is in clear violation of international humanitarian law and constitutes a callous disregard for civilians. Second, Mr. President, Russia's disregard for international law is having an outside impact on children who suffer some of the gravest consequences. For 3 consecutive years, the Russian armed forces have been listed in the annex of the Secretary General's annual report on children in armed conflict for committing grave violations against Ukrainian children. From the latest report, we have learned that Russia's actions in the past year have reached new levels of brutality. In addition to the unlawful abduction of thousands of Ukrainian children, Russian forces killed and maimed 671 children, according to the report. They also attacked over 500 schools and more than 300 hospitals. This marks a 60% increase in child casualties and a staggering 150% increase in attacks on schools and hospitals compared to 2023. We recall that civilian objects are protected under international humanitarian law and must not be targeted. Denmark fully supports the Secretary General's call for Russia to immediately cease all violations against children. We urge Russia to take concrete steps to prevent further violations by developing and implementing a joint action plan with the United Nations. Third, Mr. President, Russia's senseless, full-scale aggression continues in its 4th year. It must come to an end. For months, Ukraine has been ready to agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. We call on Russia to accept this offer without any delay. Such a response would reflect a genuine commitment to peace. While we welcome the agreement on new exchanges of prisoners of war reached in Istanbul this week, we cannot ignore that the Kremlin continues to pursue its illegal and brutal full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This week, Russia has continued to destroy cities, killing civilians, and targeting civilian infrastructure across Ukraine. These actions undermine the foundations for peace. Mr. President, in conclusion, while Russia's attacks intensify, we increase our support for Ukraine. We reiterate our call for a just, sustainable, and lasting peace in line with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. We have reaffirmed the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. Denmark will continue to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, until the Ukrainians can once again live in peace and freedom in their own country. I thank you.
Thank the representative of Denmark for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Tout d'abord, je remercie Monsieur le Sous-secrétaire général Miroslav Jenka et Madame la Sous-secrétaire générale Jos Mesiua pour leurs exposés qui nous rappellent la gravité de la situation. Monsieur le Président, il y a une semaine, le président ukrainien a redit qu'il était prêt à engager des discussions de paix directes avec le président russe. Quelle a été la réponse de la Russie? Des frappes massives sur les villes ukrainiennes, très loin du front, dans la nuit du 20 au 21 juillet. Notre ministre, M. Jean-Noël Barrot, est arrivé à Kiev quelques heures plus tard pour réitérer notre détermination à accroître la pression sur la Russie et à donner à l'Ukraine les moyens de se défendre. Nous le faisons avec l'Union européenne. En attaquant systématiquement des cibles civiles et des infrastructures essentielles à la vie quotidienne, la Russie veut semer la peur et la division en Ukraine. Faute de pouvoir percer sur le front depuis maintenant plus de 3 ans, elle tente de briser l'arrière. La Russie doit comprendre que cette stratégie de violation massive et systématique du droit international humanitaire et des conventions de Genève est non seulement illégale, mais de surcroît inutile. La Russie ne parviendra pas à saper le moral du peuple ukrainien, dont la France salue la résilience et le courage. La Russie vise aussi systématiquement les infrastructures énergétiques, n'hésitant pas à compromettre la sécurité et la sûreté nucléaire. À Tchernobyl, notre ministre a pu constater les dégâts considérables provoqués en février dernier par un drone Shahed russe qui a perforé le sarcophage de confinement servant à prévenir les émissions radioactives. Monsieur le Président, à Istanbul, il y a 2 jours, l'Ukraine a réitéré sa disponibilité à mettre en place un cessez-le-feu immédiat et sans condition, comme elle le fait depuis 5 mois. La Russie l'a à nouveau refusé. Elle a réitéré les exigences maximalistes contenues dans le mémorandum qu'elle avait transmis à l'Ukraine le 2 juin dernier. La Russie ne peut exiger comme condition à l'arrêt des combats la capitulation de l'Ukraine. Monsieur le Président, pour être à la hauteur de sa responsabilité, ce Conseil ne peut se contenter de déplorer les souffrances des civils et appeler à des pourparlers de paix. Le Conseil doit, premièrement, nommer les choses et rappeler les fondamentaux du conflit. Face à l'aspiration des Ukrainiens à la liberté et à la démocratie, c'est la Russie qui a envahi 2 fois l'Ukraine, en 2014 et 2022, en violation flagrante de la Charte. Deuxièmement, condamner les violations du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme commises par la Russie et l'appeler à y mettre fin. Les attaques indiscriminées contre des civils constituent des crimes de guerre. Troisièmement, adresser à la Russie ces appels à la fin des combats. C'est la Russie qui peut immédiatement mettre un terme à cette guerre d'agression et accepter le cessez-le-feu. Quatrièmement, rappeler sans relâche que la paix, pour être durable, doit respecter le droit international. Une négociation n'aboutira que si la Russie l'accepte de bonne foi et si elle se décide à respecter l'indépendance, la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine, qui doit voir sa sécurité assurée pour l'avenir. Dans l'immédiat, l'urgence est de nous unir pour exiger un cessez-le-feu complet, immédiat et inconditionnel. La résolution 2774, votée par la Russie, demande que soit mis fin au conflit dans les plus brefs délais. Faisons-la respecter. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank Pakistan for convening this meeting. I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary General Yensa and Assistant Secretary General Musuyev for their briefings. Mr. President, since the beginning of this war 3.5 years ago, the collective voice of the international community has repeatedly condemned Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, and has been calling on Russia to fully respect international law, the UN Charter, and relevant General Assembly resolutions. These calls were strengthened with renewed conviction since the launching of the US-led peace initiative. Sadly, as we have just heard from our briefers, the war is not ending. On the contrary, for yet another month, Russian forces have been attacking the cities of Ukraine, causing death and destruction. June has been the single deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians since at least May 2022, with the number of missiles and loitering munitions launched by Russia into Ukraine increasing tenfold from June 2024. Once more, the vulnerable, children, women, and the elderly are disproportionately affected, with 100 casualties among children alone. This trend has continued in July. These attacks have inter alia targeted energy infrastructure and disrupted power supply to the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant for the first time since December 2023, further endangering nuclear safety. We note with extreme concern that according to the WHO, nearly 40% of all attacks against healthcare facilities worldwide this year took place in Ukraine, causing casualties among medical personnel and patients. We are likewise concerned about reports on the use of chemical weapons on the battlefield. Greece joins the Secretary General in strong condemnation of the latest severe attacks by Russia against civilian population and infrastructure in Ukraine, and we also condemn any attacks against civilians which constitute blatant violations of international law, including humanitarian and human rights law. Mr. President, this year's annual report of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict verified a 105% increase in grave violations against the children of Ukraine, identifying for the third consecutive year the Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups as responsible for these violations. These findings are compounded by this year's recently released Council of Europe's report on the human rights situation in the territories of Ukraine temporarily occupied by Russia, which demonstrates that Russia's war of aggression has continued to lead to immense human suffering. Mr. President, ensuring accountability is both a prerequisite for peace and a deterrent for further war. On that front, Greece welcomes the July 9th ruling of the European Court of Human Rights, in which the court held Russia unanimously accountable for flagrant and widespread abuses of at least 10 fundamental human rights in eastern Ukraine between 2014 and at least 2022. Greece also welcomes the signing of the agreement between the Council of Europe and Ukraine for the establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Mr. President, we have long advocated for peace, which is long overdue. We welcome the 3 rounds of direct bilateral talks and the agreements on exchange of prisoners, including the most recent one on July 23rd. However, we regret that peace efforts have not produced any other tangible results and have eventually stalled. We reiterate that no peace effort can have any substantial results if hostilities continue. Therefore, it is imperative that any peace efforts should be approached in good faith, starting by agreeing to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire as the first step towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, in line with international law and the UN Charter, and in full respect of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. Now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I also would like to thank ASG Yencha and ASG Umsuya for their informative briefings and welcome the participation of Ukraine in today's meeting. Mr. President, as the war in Ukraine stretches beyond 1,250 days, the human, moral, economic, and geopolitical costs of this aggression continues to mount. Contrary to the hopes of many who yearns to escape from this dark tunnel, Russia is intensifying its relentless attacks, now deploying hundreds of deadly drones and missiles daily. Indeed, June marked the highest monthly civilian casualty toll in 3 years, with 232 killed and 1,343 wounded. The humanitarian situation in Ukraine continues to deteriorate, and civilian suffering is deepening. We reiterate that such large-scale and indiscriminate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure constitute a clear violations of international humanitarian law. The Republic of Korea once again strongly calls for a full, immediate, and unconditional cessation of hostilities to prevent further civilian casualties. In this regard, we support the recent call by the United States to achieve a long overdue ceasefire within 50 days. And we urge Russia to respond to this call, one that has been echoed by nearly every other member of the international community. Now more than ever, as the casualties continue to mount and the war shows no signs of abating, the urgency for a ceasefire is undeniable. We have already witnessed the concrete benefits of such a ceasefire during another major ongoing conflict. Although the humanitarian situation in Gaza remains dire today, earlier this year, during the fleeting ceasefire in Gaza, humanitarian conditions on the ground markedly improved. Hundreds of aid trucks were able to enter Gaza, delivering much-needed food, medicine, and other humanitarian supplies to suffering Palestinians. This clearly demonstrates that an immediate halt to hostilities is not merely symbolic. It is a vital step toward alleviating civilian suffering and creating the necessary space for diplomacy. On another front, we also take note of the third round of talks recently held between Ukraine and Russia in Istanbul to seek an end to the conflict and bring about sustainable peace. We do not expect a miraculous breakthrough from just a few meetings. However, we do hope for the restoration of normalcy for the innocent civilians who have endured more than 3 years of immense hardship. They need a respite from the terrible nightly drone swarms, now numbering in the hundreds each day. We believe the realistic path to ending this war and achieving lasting peace begins with a prompt ceasefire agreement, followed by a sustained negotiations supported by confidence-building measures such as prisoner exchanges and return of fallen soldiers. These efforts must not be used to buy time for destructive or territorial ambitions, but instead must reflect the genuine political will to end this war. Mr. President, a major obstacle to achieving these goals lies in the ongoing military cooperation between Russia and the DPRK. Despite repeated condemnations from the international community, this illicit collaboration has been prolonging the war in Ukraine by enabling the large-scale transfer of ammunition, artillery, and missiles from the DPRK to Russia, as well as the deployment of North Korean troops in a flagrant violation of the UN Charter and relevant Security Council resolutions. Moreover, such cooperation poses grave risks to the security of the Republic of Korea and to regional stability. Potential military assistance and technological transfer from Russia to DPRK represent a serious and growing threat to the safety of the Korean people and to broader peace in Northeast Asia. We reiterate that all forms of cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang must fully comply with relevant Security Council resolution and international law. In closing, Mr. President, the international community can no longer afford to stand idly by while this senseless war continues. This is why we must come together, raising a united voice to demand an immediate ceasefire and pursue a just and lasting peace. We sincerely hope that those who initiate this war will heed the principled call of the international community. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thanking the representative of Republic of Korea for the statement, I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to thank ASG Yanka and ASG Monsieur for your informative briefings today. Colleagues, the world has rallied around President Trump's call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine has agreed, and we echo that call again today. Yet week after week, night after night, we see the number of Russian assaults grow. June was the deadliest month yet, and July is on track to be even deadlier. This makes a mockery of the diplomacy that Russia claims to support. And the consequences are even more devastating for the people of Ukraine. Across 5 nights, from the 18th to the 23rd of July, Russia launched over 940 drones and 59 missiles at Ukrainian cities, killing 20 civilians and injuring a further 216. Just days before, a record-breaking 728 long-range drones were launched on Ukraine in a single day. Since the start of the invasion, over 13,500 civilians have been killed and more than 34,000 injured. This includes more than 200 children killed or injured since March alone. We cannot allow ourselves to become desensitized to these figures. Behind each Russian strike, there is a person, a family, a community whose lives have been torn apart by Russia's brutal military invasion. The Shigids are one such family. On the 5th of June, as a Ukrainian firefighter arrived at the scene of a Russian attack on Chernihiv, he discovered that his wife, his daughter, and his grandson had all been killed. His grandson was only a year old. 3 generations lost to cold-blooded Russian brutality in just one night. This is not an isolated incident. Families like the Shigids are being torn apart across Ukraine and have been since February 2022. Russia has a clear and unqualified obligation to uphold the UN Charter. Russia also has an obligation to respect the Geneva Conventions and to the protection of civilians under international humanitarian law. There is simply no justification for brutal aggression like this. The reality is clear. Ukraine, a country illegally invaded by Russia, continues to show its commitment to peace. But President Putin prefers war. He is shunning diplomatic efforts made in good faith to bring an end to this horror, a horror of his own making. There is no ambiguity about what needs to come next. It is time for Russia to stop prevaricating and agree to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire as the first step towards a just and lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening today's meeting. I would also like to thank Assistant Secretaries General Yencha and Msuya for the updates provided and for their work. In the 33 days that have elapsed since our last meeting on this topic, the situation on the ground has gotten considerably worse. The continuation of intense fighting in several regions and escalated attacks on civilian infrastructure continue to devastate civilian lives and drive displacement in Ukraine. Meanwhile, nuclear safety and security remain under threat, with the IAEA reporting yesterday that their team at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant continues to hear shelling, explosions, and gunfire almost every day. Earlier this month, the site's training center was targeted in a drone strike, resulting in damage to its roof. Guyana deplores the ongoing attacks on or near nuclear power stations, given the risk of severe and indiscriminate harm that could result. We call on the parties to the conflict to eliminate such plans from their military strategies. Mr. President, we have been consistent in reaffirming full respect for the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. Likewise, we have also been consistent in calling for a peaceful end to this war. We welcome the talks that have taken place in Istanbul and join fellow council members in welcoming the recent agreement for another round of exchanges of prisoners of war. Nevertheless, we have noted that these periods of progress continue to be interrupted by increased attacks and heightened rhetoric. We urge the parties to ensure that progress is sustained by prioritizing the protection of civilians, fulfilling their international legal obligations, and ultimately agreeing to end this war peacefully and definitively. Guyana believes that many opportunities have been missed since the adoption of Resolution 2774 5 months ago, a resolution which, while not perfect, provided the first glimmer of hope since this conflict erupted. 5 months on, it appears as if the main obstacles standing in the way of peace are the absence of firm political will and an unwillingness to compromise and find common ground. Meanwhile, the civilian death toll continues to mount, and many more lives are devastated and put on pause. We call on the parties to engage in good faith and to bring an end to the suffering of the millions of men, women, and children. This includes those displaced from their homes and mourning the loss of loved ones in both Ukraine and Russia. Guyana further reiterates its call for the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine and to comply with its obligation under international humanitarian law to facilitate unhindered humanitarian access to those in need in the temporarily occupied territories. Mr. President, colleagues, it may be tempting, I'm sure, to imagine that one party will emerge victorious from this conflict. However, with nearly 50,000 civilian casualties reported to date and an unprecedented humanitarian crisis emerging, there will be no winners in this war. While the buildings are damaged can be rebuilt, the lives lost cannot be resuscitated, nor the injuries erased. But one thing remains clear: a call for peace is always relevant, and the choice of peace is never too late. The time to answer that call and to choose peace is now. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Yencha and Assistant Secretary General Joyce Msuya for your briefings. And I welcome the representative of Ukraine. More than 100 days have now passed since this Council adopted a resolution imploring a swift end to the war and urging a lasting peace between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Since then, there have been some positive developments. UN Security Council Resolution 2774 paved the way for technical talks in Saudi Arabia and bilateral talks in Istanbul, resulting in the return of thousands of prisoners of war. But the progress we've seen has fallen far short of what is needed. Ignoring this Council's call for lasting peace in Resolution 2774, Russia has continued to kill Ukrainian civilians. Russian drones and missiles have struck schools, playgrounds, apartment buildings, and nursing homes. Russia has deployed thousands of DPRK troops to its front lines and sent tens of thousands of Russian soldiers to die on the battlefield just to gain a small amount of ground. Mr. President, colleagues, the war, killing, and destruction must end. As President Trump has repeatedly stated, there is no military solution to this conflict. On July 14th, the President of the United States put Russian President Putin on notice to agree to a peace deal within 50 days. If Russia does not agree within that time frame to stop the attacks, the United States is prepared to take further measures. Additionally, we again urge all countries, including China, to stop exports to Russia of dual-use goods that contribute to Russia's war industrial base and enable its drone and missile attacks against Ukraine. Beijing's claim to have implemented strong export controls on dual-use goods falls apart in the face of daily recovery of Chinese-produced components in the drones, weapons, and vehicles that Russia uses against Ukraine. Mr. President, now is the time for all UN member states to do our part to bring this war to an end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, I wish to express my appreciation to ASG Yanka and Masuya for their briefing. My delegation remains gravely concerned by the continued deterioration of the humanitarian and security situation in Ukraine. The latest developments only reinforce the urgency and the complexity of the crisis before us. In that regard, I would like to make the following points. First, we are deeply troubled by the ongoing escalation of attacks impacting civilians and essential civilian infrastructure. The protection of civilians and critical infrastructure are obligations enshrined under international law. We reiterate that all parties to the conflict must respect and uphold these principles without exception. Second, we remain convinced that there can be no military solution to this conflict. Dialogue and diplomacy are the sole means to bring an end to this long-standing conflict and achieve sustainable peace. Continued hostilities serve only to prolong suffering and further diminish prospect for a sustainable peace. Diplomatic channels must remain open. In that context, we welcome the ongoing discussions in Istanbul between the Russian Federation and Ukraine concerning the exchange of prisoners of war. While these negotiations are not without challenges, they represent a constructive step on the humanitarian track. Progress, even incremental, on such issues can pave the way for broader engagement and contribute to building the trust necessary for peace. Third, we emphasize the important role of the international community in supporting diplomatic initiatives and fostering conditions conducive to a peaceful settlement. Any durable resolution will require compromise, confidence-building measures, and genuine commitment to dialogue. We reiterate our call upon all parties to exercise restraint, recommit to diplomatic efforts, and work towards an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire. In closing, Mr. President, our delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for all efforts aimed at addressing the underlying causes of the conflict and achieving a just and lasting peace in accordance with the United Nations Charter. The people of Ukraine and all those affected by this crisis deserve a future founded upon peace, security, and dignity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor presidente. Panamá lamenta el accidente aéreo ocurrido en la Federación Rusa el día de ayer. Extendemos nuestras condolencias a los familiares de los fallecidos, así como al pueblo y gobierno de Rusia. Señor presidente, agradecemos la convocatoria de esta sesión informativa y la oportuna participación del secretario asistente Yencha y de la secretaria asistente Joyce Msuya, quienes nos han brindado información detallada sobre la situación humanitaria y de seguridad en Ucrania. Panamá sigue observando con profunda preocupación la prolongación de la guerra en Ucrania. Resulta alarmante que este conflicto, con sus devastadoras consecuencias humanitarias, se ha convertido en una constante en nuestra agenda. No debemos permitir que la violencia pierda su capacidad de conmocionarnos, ni que la normalización del sufrimiento se imponga sobre nuestra responsabilidad colectiva. Como en cualquier conflicto, los más afectados son quienes menos responsabilidad tienen, la población civil que solo desea vivir en paz. Esta realidad nos obliga a preguntarnos, ¿es que hemos aprendido realmente de las tragedias que marcaron el siglo XX? Ataques a escuelas, a hospitales, a infraestructuras vitales, una población cada vez más vulnerable, agotada física y emocionalmente. Todo esto no puede ni debe normalizarse. Los detallados informes que nos han ofrecido el señor Yencha y la señora Msuya describen con cifras de por sí elocuentes el efecto lamentable de los ataques recíprocos, el saldo trágico, individualizado y colectivo de víctimas militares y civiles, los desplazamientos humanos y el deterioro de la situación humanitaria, así como el costo ascendiente de la reconstrucción de Ucrania. Todas tristes consecuencias de un conflicto que en vez de terminar, continúa sin visos de conclusión. Poca atención le ponemos a las víctimas de combatientes, pero los informes disponibles sugieren que los combatientes, aproximadamente 950,000 soldados rusos han muerto o resultado heridos y que se han dado 400,000 bajas ucranianas desde el inicio del conflicto. Cada día que dejamos pasar sin actuar profundiza el trauma colectivo y deteriora las bases mismas del contrato social. No podemos ni debemos permitir que el miedo y la desesperanza sustituyan a la seguridad y la dignidad. Es urgente redoblar los esfuerzos diplomáticos y humanitarios para proteger a quienes ya no pueden protegerse por sí mismos, conforme a nuestras obligaciones en virtud de los convenios de Ginebra. Presidente, nos reunimos aquí, en esta sala nacida del espíritu de 1945, precisamente para evitar que se repitieran situaciones como estas. Sin embargo, las cifras que se nos presentan mes tras mes desafían ese compromiso fundacional. Nos preocupa de manera particular la seguridad nuclear. A inicios de este mes, un ataque dejó completamente desconectada la planta de Zaporilla. El pasado 13 de julio, el equipo del OIEA reportó disparos de armas ligeras cerca de la central, además de incidentes con drones en sus alrededores. Como bien lo advirtió el director general Rafael Grossi, la situación en torno a la central es cada vez más delicada y cualquier incidente podría tener consecuencias catastróficas. Panamá se hace eco de las palabras del secretario general Antonio Guterres, pronunciadas el pasado 5 de junio, en las que condenó los ataques a gran escala con misiles y drones. La continuidad de los ataques pareciera ser una de las principales características del conflicto y representa una amenaza directa para la estabilidad regional y global. Panamá reitera que una paz justa y duradera en Ucrania pasa por el respeto pleno a su soberanía, integridad territorial e independencia política de conformidad con los principios consagrados en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Exhortamos a las partes a cesar de inmediato las hostilidades y a cumplir con las obligaciones establecidas en el derecho internacional, incluido el derecho internacional humanitario. En febrero de este año, una resolución de este Consejo ofreció una ventana de oportunidad a una solución negociada. Lamentablemente, esa oportunidad fue desaprovechada. En este sentido, alentamos a las partes a continuar las conversaciones directas como la celebrada esta semana en Estambul, que alcanzó un nuevo acuerdo para el intercambio de prisioneros de guerra. De igual manera, reiteramos que solo mediante el diálogo, la diplomacia y el respeto a esos principios podrá frenarse esta espiral de sufrimiento y restablecerse un camino hacia una solución pacífica sostenible. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Panama for this statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank you for convening this important meeting at the request of Slovenia, Denmark, France, Greece, the Republic of Korea, and the United Kingdom. I also thank Assistant Secretary Generals Miroslav Jenča and Ms. Joyce Musia for their comprehensive and sobering briefings. We welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine in today's meeting. Mr. President, the end of the Ukraine conflict remains a complex but not insurmountable objective. Encouragingly, 3 rounds of talks in Istanbul between the parties have facilitated the exchange of thousands of prisoners of war and detainees, as well as progress in the return of over 300 Ukrainian children by the Russian Federation. While a ceasefire agreement remains elusive, such confidence-building measures, alongside the reported intention to establish joint working groups to regularly address political, humanitarian, and military dimensions, offer signs of continued engagement through diplomatic channels. In this regard, we wish to make 3 key points. First, Sierra Leone is deeply concerned by the indiscriminate use of long-range missiles and drones in densely populated areas, resulting in widespread civilian suffering and destruction of civilian infrastructure. According to the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, missile and drone attacks in June 2025 were 10-fold higher during the same period last year, causing extensive damage to energy, water, medical, and other vital civilian infrastructure. Since the beginning of this year, approximately 6,754 civilians have reportedly lost their lives, including an alarming increase in casualties among children. Reports from UNICEF further indicate that about 70% of the children in Ukraine, roughly 3.5 million, are facing severe material deprivation, including lack of access to food, clothing, heating, and education. For more than 3 years, the lives of these children have been shaped by fear, loss, and trauma, a situation that must not be normalized. In this regard, we underscore the urgent need to sustain and strengthen humanitarian assistance to reach the estimated 12.7 million people currently in need across Ukraine. We reiterate that the protection of civilians must be central to all military operations, with strict adherence to the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution, and call on all parties to uphold their obligations under international law. Second, we urge the parties to the conflict to demonstrate the necessary political will and commit to structured negotiations aimed at achieving a sustainable resolution of the conflict. Building on the progress made in Istanbul, we join others in encouraging high-level political dialogue to address substantive matters for a ceasefire and a lasting peace. We welcome reports of private engagements between the heads of the respective delegations and urge continued negotiations in good faith with a focus on political and humanitarian priorities. We commend the sustained efforts of the United States, European leaders, and other partners in support of a comprehensive ceasefire. In light of the deep human suffering caused by the conflict, we appeal to the parties to prioritize the well-being of their citizens and seize the opportunity to bring an end to hostilities. Third and finally, the international community must begin to prepare for the post-conflict reconstruction and stabilization of Ukraine. The scale of devastation is immense. An estimated 139,000 square kilometers of territory are reportedly contaminated with landmines and explosive remnants of war, posing enduring threats to safety and livelihood. Short-term financial requirements for budgetary support, reconstruction, and humanitarian assistance have been estimated at approximately 40 billion annually by the Kyiv School of Economics. According to the World Bank's Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment done in February this year, long-term reconstruction costs may amount to over 524 billion in the coming decade. Thus, the challenge ahead is significant. We welcome international coordination mechanisms supporting Ukraine's recovery, including the Multi-Donor Coordination Platform and the Ukraine Recovery Conference. The guiding principles are outlined in the Lugano Declaration: partnership, reform focus, transparency, democratic participation, inclusivity, and sustainability remain fundamental. We also note with appreciation the increased engagement of the private sector in the recent recovery conference held in Rome, underscoring the crucial link between sustainable development and durable peace. In conclusion, Mr. President, we reaffirm that only a comprehensive ceasefire and peace agreement will enable the government and people of Ukraine, including over 10 million displaced persons, to begin the arduous process of recovery, healing, and rebuilding. Sierra Leone reiterates its support for all efforts that seek to protect civilians, uphold international humanitarian law, and advance a just and lasting peace that respects the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and internationally recognized borders of Ukraine, while addressing the legitimate security concerns of all parties to the conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. أود بداية أن أشكر كل من مساعد الأمين العام لأوروبا وآسيا الوسطى والأمريكيتين السيد ميروسلاف يانشا، ومساعدة الأمين العام للشؤون الإنسانية ومنسقة الإغاثة في حالات الطوارئ بالإنابة السيدة جويس مسويا على إحاطتيهما القيمتين. السيد الرئيس، تتواصل للأسف الحرب الدائرة بين روسيا وأوكرانيا، ويتواصل معها حصد الأرواح البريئة من المدنيين بما فيهم النساء والأطفال والشيوخ، إضافة إلى استمرار تسجيل خسائر فادحة في الممتلكات والبنى التحتية بما فيها المنشآت الحيوية، وهو الأمر الذي حذرت الجزائر منه عدة مرات لما فيه من خرق صارخ لقواعد القانون الدولي بما في ذلك القانون الدولي الإنساني. وبالرغم من الزخم الإيجابي الذي شهدناه مؤخرا والذي تجسد في لقاءات مباشرة طال انتظارها بين الطرفين، إلا أن منطق المواجهة والقتال لا زال يسيطر في الميدان، كما لا يزال وللأسف منطق الاستقطاب يؤثر في مجريات الأمور، وهو ما يقوض المساعي الدبلوماسية الرامية لإنهاء هذه الحرب. إن هذا النزاع لم تتأثر من تداعياته شعوب المنطقة فحسب، بل وصل صداه إلى العديد من مناطق العالم وخاصة الدول النامية جراء الاضطرابات الارتدادية لهذا النزاع على أسواق الغذاء والطاقة عبر العالم. وأمام هذا الوضع يود وفد بلاد اليوم التأكيد على النقاط التالية. أولاً، تجدد الجزائر دعوتها للطرفين للتحلي بالرزانة وضبط النفس ووضع حياة المدنيين وسلامتهم على رأس أولوياتهم، والتقيد التام بقواعد القانون الدولي بما فيها القانون الدولي الإنساني، اللذان يمنعان بصريح العبارة استهداف المدنيين والبنى التحتية المدنية. ثانياً، تؤكد الجزائر من جديد على قناعتها الراسخة بأن الحل لن يتأتى بقوة السلاح أو بفرض الهيمنة، وإنما عن طريق تفضيل لغة الحوار البناء والجامع والمفاوضات، وقدرة الطرفين على تجاوز الخلافات وإيجاد حل سلمي كفيل بوضع حد نهائي للأعمال العدائية وإنهاء الحرب. وفي هذا الصدد تدعو الجزائر الطرفين إلى تركيز الجهود على المسار التفاوضي الجاري والاستلهام بالنتائج الإيجابية التي تم تحقيقها حتى الآن من خلال تبادل الأسرى للوصول إلى حل سلمي عادل ودائم يستند إلى مبادئ ومقاصد ميثاق الأمم المتحدة ويستجيب لمشاغل الطرفين الأمنية المشروعة. ثالثاً، تجدد الجزائر دعوتها للمجتمع الدولي لمضاعفة جهوده الدبلوماسية الرامية إلى خلق مناخ ملائم للمفاوضات يعمل على تقريب وجهات النظر بعيداً عن الاستقطاب والحسابات الجيوسياسية الضيقة. وفي الأخير، تجدد الجزائر التزامها الثابت بدعم أي جهود دولية ترمي إلى إيجاد حل سياسي سلمي يرضي الطرفين ووضع حد لهذه الحرب وإعادة المنطقة برمتها إلى بر الأمان. وشكرا.
I thank the representative of Algeria for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
主席。 席。我要感谢严恰助理秘书长、姆苏雅助理秘书长的通报。我们注意到，俄乌近一段时间以来，持续落实此前谈判达成的共识，推进交换战俘与阵亡士兵遗体等工作，还于日前举行了第3轮直接谈判，就继续交换战俘等人道主义问题达成新的共识。中方对上述积极进展表示欢迎，呼吁当事方保持和谈势头，持续积累共识，不断增强互信，最终达成一份全面、持久、有约束力的和平协议。我们也注意到，俄乌近日持续针对对方实施大规模无人机和导弹袭击，造成大量人员伤亡和设施损毁，中方对此深表忧虑和痛心，再次敦促冲突当事方展现最大程度的克制，切实遵守国际人道法，在任何情况下都要避免攻击平民和民用基础设施。当务之急是双方共同努力，推动战场局势早日降温。我们还注意到，俄乌近来围绕如何恢复欧洲和平、实现危机政治解决相互喊话。国际社会主要各方也多次就对话谈判、停火止战释放积极信号，持续开展劝和促谈的外交努力。中方欢迎所有通向和平的努力，鼓励俄乌双方继续展现政治意愿和灵活姿态，国际社会继续发出和平呼声，凝聚和平共识，开展和平努力。所有各方共同为推动危机的政治解决做出切实努力。主席，中方在乌克兰问题上始终秉持客观公正立场，坚持劝和促谈，推动政治解决。我们以习近平主席提出的4个应该为遵循，积极开展外交斡旋，同俄罗斯、乌克兰双方均保持着有效沟通，还同巴西等全球南方国家发起成立乌克兰危机和平之友小组，为停火止战、实现和平汇聚更大合力。中方将一如既往地为危机的政治解决发挥建设性作用。主席，我要对美国代表刚才的发言作出回应。正如我们此前多次在安理会指出的那样，中国不是乌克兰危机的制造者，也不是当事方。中国从未向冲突任何一方提供过致命武器，始终严格管控军民两用物项，包括无人机的出口。我们敦促美方停止在乌克兰问题上甩锅推责、制造对立，多为停火止战、劝和促谈做出一些切实的努力。另外，主席，我愿借此机会多说几句。本周二，安理会就和平解决争端进行公开辩论，美国代表借题发挥，在会上就南海问题对中国进行攻击指责。本周四，安理会就联合国同伊斯兰合作组织的合作举行公开会，美国代表再次挑衅，就涉疆问题对中国污蔑抹黑。今天安理会就乌克兰问题进行审议，美国代表又跳了出来，散布关于中国的虚假谎言。一周之内，美国接二连三地在安理会对中国无端发难，这一系列的表现，只能证明，美国关心的不是维护国际和平与安全，不是推动战争冲突的政治解决，而是借机攻击打压他国，进行政治操弄，服务自身议程。美国作为安理会的常任理事国，应该对自己的言行感到羞愧和耻辱。 我们敦促美方早日改弦更张，建设性的参与安理会的工作。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин председатель. Честно признаюсь, когда мы узнали о запросе сегодняшнего заседания по украинской тематике нашими западными коллегами, где-то в голове промелькнула мысль о том, что его поводом стало полученное всеми нами в начале июля пронзительное письмо группы украинских политических заключенных на имя председателя Совета Безопасности. Напомню, что его подписали такие известные политики, правозащитники, госслужащие и депутаты, являющиеся сегодня узниками режима Зеленского, как Елена Бережная, Вячеслав Богуслаев, Виталий Гордына, Артем Дмитрук, Александр Дубинский, Олег Кулинич, Мирослав Олешко, Александр Олейников и Юрий Рябуха. Вы все имели возможность его прочитать и убедиться в том, что количество политзаключенных на Украине исчисляется тысячами. Не выполняются нормы Конституции и законы. Люди бросаются в тюрьму за, цитирую, «призывы к миру и проведению выборов, за противодействие войне между славянскими народами, за религиозные и политические убеждения, за критику насильственной мобилизации, за гражданскую позицию». Конец цитаты. Украинские политзаключенные обращаются к Совету Безопасности ООН с призывом добиться отмены, цитирую, «всех незаконных санкций, введенных с начала войны против граждан Украины, как неконституционных и репрессивных мер политического преследования». Конец цитаты. Это, по сути, уже не просто письмо, а крик души. Мы не стали тогда привлекать внимание Совета к этому документу, чтобы не давать повода нашим недругам попытаться выдать это все за российскую пропаганду, как они всегда поступают в подобных случаях. Достаточно вспомнить замученного в январе 2024 года в застенках СБУ американского гражданина Гонсало Лиру, правозащитные разоблачения которого киевский режим также списывал на российскую пропаганду. С 2014 года любая критика украинской власти в подаче самой этой власти и ее спонсоров – это российская пропаганда. Эта нехитрая логика работает и сегодня. Насильственная мобилизация, о которой упомянули в письме правозащитники, это тоже, как утверждает киевская клика, выдумки Кремля. Однако все украинцы знают, что военкомы Зеленского или ТЦК, как их называют на Украине, в прямом смысле слова похищают людей средь бела дня на улицах, в торговых центрах, в аптеках, в спортивных клубах. При этом используются самые жесткие, а подчас и бесчеловечные методы. Сотни, если не тысячи случаев гибели и калечения призывников, о которых говорят все украинцы, властью отрицаются. Многочисленные ролики в соцсетях, где мужчин хватают на улицах, отбивают от семей, жестоко избивают и заталкивают в автобусы, зачастую оставляя их маленьких детей одних на улице, цинично называются украинскими чиновниками постановками Мосфильма. Если верить украинской власти, то украинцы вообще стоят в очередях из тех, кто хочет идти на фронт. Представляете, каково простым гражданам слышать такую чудовищную ложь? Недавно, однако, эта система коллективного вранья и круговой поруки дала сбой. Работники одного из ТЦК в Закарпатье в ходе очередной облавы нанесли серьезные травмы 45-летнему Йожефу Шебештьену, этническому венгру, гражданину Украины и Венгрии. В результате чего он попал в больницу, где и скончался по прошествии нескольких недель. И это при том, что Йожеф Шебештьен изначально был признан неподлежащим призыву по состоянию здоровья. Таких случаев с украинцами сотни. Они стали нормой для концлагеря имени Зеленского, как давно уже называют свою страну сами украинцы. И только для наших западных коллег эта тема табу. Об этом правовом беспределе дружно молчат и все европейские и американские правозащитники, которым дана команда говорить об Украине либо хорошо, либо никак. И о несчастном Йожефе Шебештьене никто бы за рубежом так и не узнал, но он, к досаде Зеленского и его спонсоров, оказался венгром. В итоге МИД Венгрии выразил решительный протест в связи с убийством своего гражданина и потребовал официальных объяснений. В ответ украинские власти заявили о якобы имевшей место попытке побега со стороны мобилизованного и о том, что он умер в больнице по естественной причине. Разумеется, украинская сторона, как и во всех подобных случаях, несмотря на очевидные факты, отказалась нести какую-либо ответственность за гибель мужчины. Это вранье, разумеется, не устроило Будапешт, и скандал продолжается до сих пор. Господин председатель, хорошо, что есть Венгрия с ее принципиальной позицией, не желающая, в отличие от подавляющего большинства других стран ЕС, закрывать глаза на установившуюся на Украине диктатуру. А кто вступится за других несчастных, насильно мобилизованных украинцев, которые режим взорвавшегося киевского князька против их воли бросает в мясорубку во имя западных геополитических интересов? Кто, например, вступится за пожилую женщину из города Мерефа Харьковской области, которая недавно попыталась помешать сотрудникам военкомата увезти ее сына? Она из последних сил держалась за капот микроавтобуса с военнообязанными, не давая ему уехать. Но военкомы грубо оттолкнули ее, в результате чего женщина потеряла сознание и плашмя упала на проезжую часть. Кадры этого надругательства над матерью всколыхнули всю Украину. Попробуйте угадать, каков был ответ на это приспешников Зеленского. Правильно, все это было квалифицировано в качестве российской пропаганды. Украинцы уже привыкли к тому, что добиться справедливости и наказать нарушающих все правовые нормы, включая Конституцию, военкомах, в их стране невозможно. В тех редких случаях, когда уголовные производства в отношении сотрудников военкоматов в связи с имевшим место превышением ими служебных полномочий все же возбуждаются, Государственное бюро расследований, которое проводит досудебные расследования, попросту не обнаруживает состава преступления. Что остается в этих условиях простым людям, которые уже давно отказываются идти воевать? Все большее распространение получает перекрытие дорог и населенных пунктов, в которые военкомов-людоловов попросту не пускают. Излишне говорить, что украинцы люто ненавидят сотрудников ТЦК, которых в народе называют не иначе, как полицаи, по аналогии с фашистскими карателями в годы оккупации Украины во Второй мировой войне. Ненависть и отчаяние людей дошли до того, что они активно публикуют и присылают российским военным координаты военкоматов и бурно радуются, когда по ним осуществляются удары. Вот до чего довел своих граждан бывший комик, возомнивший себя диктатором всея Украины. Господин председатель, собираясь на заседание сегодня, мы ждали, что западные родители за Украину скажут, наконец, об усиливающихся в стране гонениях на лиц, исповедующих каноническое православие. Тем более, что 2 июля был принят указ президента Украины, лишающий предстоятеля Украинской Православной Церкви, митрополита Ануфрия, украинского гражданства, на основании имеющихся у Службы безопасности Украины неких псевдодоказательств того, что он якобы является гражданином Российской Федерации. Священнослужителю, который наличие гражданства отрицает, вменяется в вину также то, что он, цитирую, поддерживает связь с Московской Патриархией и сознательно противодействовал получению канонической независимости Украинской Церкви от Московской Патриархии, представители которой открыто поддерживают российскую агрессию против Украины. Конец цитаты. И это происходит в стране, где свобода вероисповедания и отделение церкви от государства закреплены в Конституции. В общем, средневековая инквизиция могла бы многому поучиться у режима Зеленского в плане преследования инакомыслия и охоты на ведьм. А наши западные коллеги лишь стыдливо опускают глаза, когда им указывают на то, что творит взросшенная ими на Украине власть. Вот и сегодня об этой возмутительной ситуации, разумеется, в Совете не было сказано ни слова. Промолчали наши западные коллеги сегодня и еще об одном направлении этой самой охоты на ведьм, которым киевский князек увлекся в последние дни. Так, прознав о том, что независимые от президента антикоррупционные структуры заготовили компромат и уголовные дела на него и его ближайших соратников, он провел через свой ручной парламент закон о переподчинении этих структур подотчетной ему Генпрокуратуре. Сейчас, в эти самые минуты, его приспешники заняты тем, что уничтожают документы, изобличающие коррупцию в высших эшелонах власти, уличающие киевского узурпатора и его соратников в растратах миллиардов долларов бюджетных средств и западной помощи. Получив в свое распоряжение папки с разоблачающими их свидетельствами, они формально отыграли назад, якобы в ответ на негативную реакцию в украинском обществе и за рубежом. Примечательно, что под ударом оказались структуры, в свое время создававшиеся под нажимом Запада и позиционировавшиеся чуть ли не как противоядие от коррупции. Отсюда и критика, которая звучит сегодня из европейских столиц. Вот только сегодня мы ее здесь не услышали. Не могу не упомянуть и о недавнем осквернении Львовского мемориального комплекса «Холм славы», что нельзя рассматривать иначе, как надругательство над памятью бесчисленных жертв фашизма и павших в борьбе с нацизмом, над бессмертным подвигом граждан Советского Союза. В угоду своим конъюнктурным интересам украинские власти кощунственно эксгумировали останки 355 советских воинов, в том числе героев Советского Союза, которые погибли в боях за освобождение Львова от немецких фашистских войск. Никто из западных представителей, а равным образом и в секретариате Всемирной организации, не нашел в себе смелости осудить эти позорные бесчинства украинских неонацистов. И это несмотря на то, что ежегодно принимаемая Генеральной Ассамблеей ООН резолюция «Борьба с героизацией нацизма, неонацизмом и другими видами практики», которые способствуют эскалации современных форм расизма, расовой дискриминации, ксенофобии и связанной с ними нетерпимости, акцентирует недопустимость разрушения памятников и мемориалов, воздвигнутых в память о подвиге тех, кто боролся с нацизмом в годы Второй мировой войны, а также незаконной эксгумации и переноса их останков. Так ради чего же созывалось сегодняшнее заседание, если не для обсуждения упомянутых мною сюжетов? Как выясняется, вновь лишь для того, чтобы искусственно поддержать украинскую тему на плаву в Совете Безопасности, особенно на фоне продолжающейся бойни и гуманитарной катастрофы в Газе, по поводу которой наши западные коллеги намного менее красноречивы. И заодно покритиковать Россию за то, что она методично и последовательно уничтожает военную инфраструктуру и связанные с ее потенциалом объекты, взрывает склады с поставляемым западным боеприпасами и техникой, наносит удары по местам скопления украинских военных, иностранных инструкторов и наемников. Одним словом, делает все то, что должна в условиях навязанной ей странами НАТО войны. Заслуживает ли это ритуальная пропагандистская установка наших западных коллег созыва заседания Совета? Не тратьте свое и наше время, дамы и господа. Мы уничтожали, уничтожаем и будем уничтожать военную инфраструктуру киевского режима в рамках демилитаризации этой страны, являющейся одной из целей нашей специальной военной операции. Мы не бьем по гражданским объектам, которые страдают исключительно от действий украинской ПВО, размещаемой в жилых кварталах городов в нарушение норм международного гуманитарного права. Об этом прекрасно знают рядовые украинцы, опасающиеся не российских ударов, а действий своих вояк. Как знают они и то, что мы воюем не с ними, а с киевским режимом, принесшим свою страну вместе со всеми украинцами в жертву западному антироссийскому проекту. Чем больше будет ваших военных поставок киевскому режиму, тем больше будет и наших ударов. Это не наш выбор. Мы давно и последовательно предлагали решить украинский кризис через дипломатию. Но вас это не устраивает. Пока вы готовы воевать с Россией и дальше руками украинцев. И то, что их становится все меньше, вас абсолютно не волнует. И поэтому вы упорно пытаетесь не замечать того, как насквозь коррумпированный режим в Киеве пытается спасти шкуру Зеленского и его клики, ставя будущее своей страны под вопрос. Об этом мы подробно поговорим на отдельном, запрошенном нами на 31 июля заседании, где мы предлагаем сконцентрироваться на обсуждении действий, подрывающих поиск путей дипломатического решения украинского конфликта, включая попытки сорвать прямой российско-украинский переговорный трек в Стамбуле. Благодарю за внимание.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for this statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Pakistan. I thank ASG Miroslav Yencha and ASG Msuya for their briefings. Pakistan remains deeply concerned by the continuing hostilities and devastating consequences of this conflict, particularly its humanitarian dimensions. Into its fourth year now, this conflict has exacted a harrowing human cost, with millions displaced, lives and livelihoods shattered, and widespread civilian infrastructure damaged. Its protracted nature has vividly laid out that war spares no one, and its effects threaten peace and stability far beyond the region. It is unfortunate that despite the diplomatic efforts at the start of the year, including Security Council Resolution 2774 and multiple limited ceasefire understandings, tangible progress has remained elusive. While prisoner exchanges and talks in Istanbul offer glimmer of hope, the ongoing violence, death, and destruction from relentless attacks has continued to cast a shadow over the nascent and fledgling peace efforts. It is imperative that the echoes for peace must be heard. Peace in Ukraine is long overdue. The calls for ending this conflict should not be allowed to be muted by the continued drums of war. In this context, Pakistan reiterates the following urgent imperatives. First, the protection of civilians is a must. The international humanitarian law is clear, and it is vital that it must be upheld unconditionally. Targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure under any pretext cannot be justified. Second, military solution and continued escalation is akin to pursuing a dead end. Continued attacks and the recent surge in these attacks has only deepened the suffering of people affected by this conflict. Sustainable peace demands de-escalation, ceasefire, and unwavering commitment to dialogue. Third, peaceful settlement must be our lodestar. That is our commitment expressed in Resolution 2788 adopted earlier this week. Diplomacy is the only path forward. We welcome the talks between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. These, however, must translate into tangible de-escalation, and steps such as prisoner swaps should catalyze broader political negotiations aimed at ending this conflict. Pakistan has been a consistent advocate for peace. From the very outset, we have called for de-escalation and giving primacy to dialogue and diplomacy. Only a sincere and meaningful dialogue which addresses security concerns of all sides, is anchored in the principles of UN Charter and international law, and respects the relevant multilateral agreements can help lead to peace that is just and enduring. Pakistan stands ready to support all regional and international efforts that pave the way for a peaceful resolution of the Ukraine conflict. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give you the floor, Madam.
Thank you. Mr. President, I would like to reply to the assertion that the United States made, and I quote, groundless accusations, and that somehow this was a misuse of the Council. I reject these allegations. The United States has raised pertinent information, and in a case in point today, we noted that materials and components supplied by China are ending up in Russian weapons, weapons which Russia is using to strike Ukraine, killing Ukrainian civilians, and destroying Ukrainian infrastructure. If China is sincere in calling for peace, it should stop fueling Russia's aggression. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement, and the representative of China has asked for the floor now to make a further statement. I give you the floor, sir.
谢谢主席，我会非常简短。中方在乌克兰问题上的立场已经重复多遍了，已经阐述多遍了。我想，就是一句话，就是我们呼吁停火止战，坚持劝和促谈。中方的努力，国际社会有目共睹。针对美方，我想要说的是，当前面对此起彼伏的热点冲突，面对错综复杂的国际形势，国际社会需要的是团结合作，不是分裂对抗。谢谢。
I thank the representative of China for those further remarks. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to express Ukraine's sincere appreciation to the Presidency of Pakistan for convening today's meeting. We are also grateful to ASG Miroslav Yencha and ASG Joyce Msuya for their insightful briefings. Tragically, since the last meeting of the Security Council in June, the security situation in Ukraine has not improved. On the contrary, the Russian Federation has intensified its campaign of terror through relentless drone and missile strikes, deliberately targeting civilians across our country. This month, each massive attack by the Russian Federation on Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure has broken previous records in the number of missiles, drones, and bombs used, resulting in further civilian casualties and destruction. Ukraine strives to ensure that the world hears the story of every life lost as a result of Russia's illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war of aggression. Each life is irreplaceable, a profound loss that can never be undone. Allow me to share one of, unfortunately, many such stories. This month, in the village of Pravdane in Kherson region, a Russian drone strike claimed the life of Dmytro, a boy just 1 year and 1 month old, as he stayed in his great-grandmother's home. The Russian military's use of FPV drones to kill people, children, has become increasingly widespread, a tactic that epitomizes the cruelty of this war of aggression. Russia's continued assault on civilians underscores the urgent need for sustained and increased international support to protect Ukraine's population. We are profoundly grateful to all partners providing air defense systems and other essential security assistance. We urge the continued and expanded supply of these vital capabilities, because for millions of Ukrainians, these systems are the difference between life and death. Enhanced military support to Ukraine is vital and is not designed to prolong the war, as the Russian side falsely claims, and will do so next week at this chamber. On the contrary, this assistance helps to stop Russia's war of aggression. If the aggressor state does not feel the consequences on its own territory, it will never stop its colonial war. Mr. President, while the Security Council meets every month and discusses the Russian Federation's war of aggression against Ukraine, Russia gradually continues its efforts to legitimize the temporary occupation of Ukrainian territories through the systematic militarization, indoctrination, and assimilation of Ukrainian children and youth. Under the guise of educational and so-called patriotic programs, Russia enforces a policy of Russification, implements its nationalist agenda, integrates local youth into its military structures, and cultivates loyalty to the Kremlin's regime, all while attempting to erase Ukrainian identity. A key component of this policy is the involvement of children and adolescents in paramilitary organizations. Through state-run movements such as Yun Armia, Young Army, and the movement of the First, the Russian Federation is building a mobilization reserve to sustain its war of aggression not only against Ukraine, but also against what it labels the collective West and other perceived adversaries. These actions constitute clear violations of Russia's obligations as the occupying power under international humanitarian law, as well as international human rights law, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Russia is exploiting education and leisure, spaces meant for development and growth, to indoctrinate and militarize children whose worldviews are still forming. They are being turned into tools of war propaganda within a system disturbingly reminiscent of North Korea. We call on the international community to confront these egregious violations and to hold the Russian Federation accountable for its systematic attempts to normalize war of aggression, temporary occupation of the territory of Ukraine, and the instrumentalization of children in its war efforts. Mr. President, the Russian Federation continues to pursue criminal policies aimed at forcibly altering the demographic composition of Ukraine's temporarily occupied territories. Under the pretense of mortgage and housing assistance, Russia is actively resettling its own citizens into these areas, a strategy designed to entrench its temporary occupation of the territory of Ukraine and undermine the rights of the local population. Through a preferential mortgage program, the Kremlin has created favorable conditions for Russian citizens, including military personnel, educators, families with young children, and workers in the cultural and social sectors to purchase property in the temporarily occupied regions of Ukraine. This program is available exclusively to Russian citizens, effectively excluding Ukrainians and using housing as a coercive tool to pressure them into accepting so-called Russian passports. Furthermore, the Kremlin has drafted legislation setting out procedures for the administrative, that is, forced expulsion of so-called foreigners residing in the temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation territory of Ukraine who have not regularized their legal status under Russian law. In reality, this includes Ukrainian citizens who, through no fault of their own, remained in the temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine but refused to accept Russian citizenship. These individuals are now labeled disloyal and deemed a threat to the Russian occupation administration and are therefore subject to expulsion from their own country. These actions represent a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. There must be no normalization of aggression through normalization of relations with the aggressor state, the Russian Federation, for as long as it continues to pursue imperialistic ambitions. And you have just witnessed how maniacal Russia is about Ukraine. Nor can there be normalization of Russia's perception as an influential power. Influence cannot be divorced from responsibility. As the renowned Ukrainian philosopher Grigory Skovoroda wrote back in the 18th century, I quote, "It is commendable not to be liked by bad people," end of quote. In the case of the Russian Federation, we say it is commendable not to be liked by a rotten state. Mr. President, it has been 136 days since the United States have put forward a proposal for a full and unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine has accepted it and has been consistently demonstrating readiness for diplomatic engagement. Ukraine has a clear political will. We remain open to any format that offers a path toward comprehensive, just, and lasting peace for Ukraine. By contrast, the Russian regime continues to show blatant contempt for diplomacy. It consistently rejects credible peace proposals and ignores repeated calls for a full and unconditional ceasefire. Russia could end this war at any moment. Instead, it chooses escalation, launching strikes on peaceful cities and intensifying offensive operations in pursuit of military advantage. Russia also uses peace efforts to spread in manipulative narratives. Following a recent negotiation round held in Istanbul on July 23, its representatives made misleading public claims regarding the initial list of abducted children submitted earlier by Ukraine. We must clarify these facts. This initial list of 339 names was submitted by Ukraine as a confidence-building measure. To date, Russia has provided fragmented responses, offering partial information on fewer than 1/5 of the children. There has been no response at all concerning over 200 children, including those from the Kherson orphanage. Russia mentioned children from the list allegedly returned. In fact, only 6 children were returned, 5 of whom are siblings. This was the result of a year-long humanitarian effort mediated by the State of Qatar, a process demonstrating the power of third-party engagement and not Russian goodwill. The Kremlin continues to expand its war of aggression against Ukraine, drawing others into its campaign of terror, including the use of North Korean troops and Iranian-manufactured weapons. We therefore call on the United States and the international community to intensify coordinated pressure on the regime in Moscow and its military-industrial complex, as well as on those around the world who support and enable Russia's war of aggression effort. The time for action is now, and there is no room for delay. Mr. President, the Russian Federation has been extensively and systematically using anti-personnel landmines as a method of warfare against Ukraine's security and defense forces. When Ukraine signed and ratified the Ottawa Convention, it did so in good faith, relying on security assurances provided by the parties to the Budapest Memorandum. It could not have foreseen that a signatory to that very memorandum, the Russian Federation, would later on launch a legal, unprovoked, and unjustified full-scale military invasion of Ukraine. As a result of Russia's widespread use of landmines, Ukraine has found itself in an unequal and unjust situation that severely constrains its inherent right to self-defense as guaranteed by Article 51 of the UN Charter. Accordingly, and in line with Article 62 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, Ukraine has taken difficult but necessary decision to suspend the operation of the 1997 Ottawa Convention. Mr. President, as none of the sovereign and independent member states of the United Nations would, nor will Ukraine accept the temporary occupation by the Russian Federation of any part of its sovereign territory. Ukraine seeks a comprehensive, just and lasting peace, one rooted in the principles of the United Charter and backed by credible, binding, and long-term security guarantees. A full, immediate, unconditional, and comprehensive ceasefire for at least 30 days remains a critical first step. It is the foundation for halting the war of aggression, restoring confidence, and enabling meaningful negotiations. At the last meeting in Istanbul, Ukraine clearly advocated for such a ceasefire. We also emphasized the importance of a high-level summit between leaders to lay the groundwork for a durable and comprehensive peace. Ukraine stands ready to convene such summit meeting till the end of August. The Security Council has a critical role to play at this juncture by expressing its unequivocal position on the urgent need to terminate hostilities as the first step towards comprehensive, just, and lasting peace for Ukraine on the basis of the UN Charter. In this context, we reiterate our call to the Council to adopt without delay a resolution demanding an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine strongly encourages all members of the Council to support and engage in moving forward this crucial initiative, thereby demonstrating a credible commitment to ending the war of aggression started by the Russian Federation. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank you for convening this meeting and the briefers for their important interventions. As Russia is persistently and brutally continuing to wage its unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine, let me draw your attention to 4 critical points. First, recently we have witnessed a significant intensification of Russia's military campaign. Growing pressure along the front line is being reported, accompanied by the intense air raids across the country. The latest renewed long-range aviation activity by Russia close near to the Polish-Ukrainian border has prompted Poland to scramble our fighter jets several times to secure our airspace. I would like to draw this Council attention to this escalation. More than 24,000 drones has been launched against Ukraine's cities since the start of this year. In the first half of 2025, Russia killed and injured almost 7,000 Ukrainian civilians, over 50% more compared to the same period last year. By the beginning of July, Russia has reportedly enlisted over 700,000 servicemen to the war, a new grim record. Second, we commend the recent announcement by the US President Donald Trump, who continues his efforts to bring Russia to the negotiation table and engage in good faith negotiations. While Ukraine maintains its willingness to reach a just agreement, Russia's response remains blatantly predictable as they continue to mock all endeavors designed to bring genuine peace. Russian officials repeated Moscow's maximalist demands that have underpinned Russia's neo-colonial war from the day one, and which are built on the feverish dream to rule Ukraine and erase its independent identity. In Istanbul, once again, we learned that Kremlin is not interested in peace. The peace is so endlessly talked about while continuing to kill, maim, and steal somebody else's land. Third, supporting Ukraine state fighting with aggressor and providing assistance based on development and humanitarian needs remain Poland's priority. This was reflected also during the Polish presidency in the EU. From the very first day of the full-fledged war in Ukraine, Poland has been a gateway of aid not only for Ukrainian refugees, but also for European logistics, energy, and medical hubs. While the ongoing Russian aggression that brings immense suffering of civilian population and destruction of the critical infrastructure in Ukraine, Poland has significantly increased its financial engagement. In 2024, we allocated more than $40 million for voluntary contributions transferred to international organizations to support Ukraine, including the UN system. Our development cooperation focuses on supporting reconstruction, civil protection, and crisis preparedness in Ukraine. Fourth, Russian war of aggression remains the main threat not only to the security of Europe and our region, but also to the whole international system based on the principles of the UN Charter and international humanitarian law, as well as to the UN system itself. Each day, Russia continues to openly violate the UN Charter, showing disrespect to jointly agreed rules and, above all, to human life. Moscow is strong-willed to reshape the world's order based on international law. This will not happen. The support for Ukrainians is our response to these Russian attempts. Poland strongly believes that a sovereign and independent Ukraine is an indispensable element of a stable world security architecture, as every peace-loving nation has the right to exist and participate in global cooperation. Therefore, we'll continue to stand by Ukraine to defend its independence and secure a just and lasting peace based on international law. We are fully convinced that the Ukraine is fighting not only for its own freedom, but also for the security of all free nations. Mr. President, in conclusion, we firmly appeal once again. It is time for Russia to end this illegal, brutal, and unsustainable war. We welcome Ukraine's interest in genuine negotiations and call Russia to engage in peace talks and to stop conducting the attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. Furthermore, we urgently, persistently call for the return of the kidnapped Ukrainian children. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, head of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for convening this meeting, and thanks to our distinguished briefers for sharing their assessment of the disastrous consequences of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. The past weeks have seen the continuation of two trends. On the one hand, Ukraine has shown a genuine commitment to peace by continuing to call for an immediate unconditional ceasefire as a first step to ending this war. On the other hand, Russia has continued its indiscriminate missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian cities and towns. Intentionally directing an attack against civilians or civilian objects or causing disproportionate civilian harm is a war crime. Earlier this month, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine published its report on the protection of civilians. It concluded that June 2025 saw the highest number of monthly civilian casualties in the past 3 years, with 232 people killed and 1,343 injured. This is unacceptable. I underline once again the EU's steadfast determination to put an end to Russia's war of aggression and to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, in line with the decisions of the UN General Assembly. We, as Europeans, together with Ukraine, have been working tirelessly to this end, and we welcome all efforts in that direction. We have joined Ukraine and international partners, including the United States, in calling for a full, unconditional, and immediate ceasefire. These pause in hostilities could serve as a vital step toward reducing civilian suffering and allow for further exchanges of prisoners of war and for the return of forcibly displaced Ukrainian children. Russia could end its war now. It could accept a full and unconditional ceasefire, as Ukraine has. We call on the Council to exert maximum pressure for a ceasefire. This would provide space for meaningful talks aimed at ending Russia's war of aggression and achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace grounded in the principles of the UN Charter and international law. We urge Russia to cease its aggression and withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine immediately, completely, and unconditionally. I remind this Council that Ukraine has an inherent right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Russia is the aggressor. Ukraine is the party defending itself. There can be no sitting on the fence on this. Furthermore, the EU strongly condemns support by third countries and actors and entities therein which enable Russia to sustain its war of aggression. The EU condemns the continued military support provided by Iran, Belarus, and the DPRK. We urge all countries to immediately cease any direct or indirect assistance to Russia in its war of aggression. The European Union, Mr. President, underlines the importance of humanitarian relief effort and confidence-building measures, notably the exchange of prisoners of war, the release of civilians, and the return of all Ukrainian civilians, particularly children, that have been forcibly transferred or deported to Russia and Belarus. We commend the efforts of OCHA and its humanitarian partners in providing assistance to those in need. full, safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access must be facilitated for humanitarian relief to reach all civilians in need, including in areas under temporary Russian occupation. In closing, Mr. President, I reaffirm the EU's unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. And I also cannot but note, Mr. President, that the Russian Federation, as it continues, including today, to shed crocodile tears for the oppressed of the world and for the UN Charter, is continuing to pursue with increased relentlessness its illegal war of aggression against Ukraine and against Ukrainian civilians. And while it is injecting hundreds of billions of dollars to its military to pursue its illegal war in Ukraine, it doesn't have a penny to offer to alleviate hunger, to alleviate poverty, to promote sustainable development for tens of countries around the world and their citizens who desperately need them. The hypocrisy, the double standards are eye-popping. We implore this Council to use all the powers in its disposal to be able to impose an unconditional and full ceasefire and to be able to promote a just, a lasting, a comprehensive peace in line with the UN Charter. We implore you. The European Union, on its part, will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Mr. President, I have the honor to address the Council on behalf of three Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and my own country, Latvia. And we thank the Presidency of the Council for convening this meeting, and we commend ASG Yencha and ASG Msuya for their comprehensive briefings and continued efforts. The UN plays a vital role in Ukraine, delivering life-saving humanitarian aid to those in need and ensuring that the facts of the war are documented with accuracy and impartiality, upholding the principles of human dignity and international accountability. Today, I would like to highlight three key messages. First, Russia's war causes immense civilian suffering and constitutes a flagrant breach of international law. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine that has been going on for almost 3.5 years and continues to inflict widespread humanitarian devastation. Over the past weeks, Russia has further intensified its drone and missile attacks, systematically targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, power grids, and schools. And many innocent lives have been lost. And these are not isolated cases. They represent a calculated campaign of terror and destruction. International humanitarian law is being ignored. The Security Council must not look away. And the international community must go beyond statements. We must act decisively to safeguard civilians and bring perpetrators to justice. Baltic states commend Ukraine's humanitarian coordination and resilience under this barrage of fire. We also welcome the results of the Force Ukraine Recovery Conference that took place in Rome on 10 and 11 July 2025. It showed mobilized further international support and investment for Ukraine's reconstruction, reform, and modernization. Second, the path to peace must begin with Russia ceasing its war. We note the Ukraine-Russia meeting held on Wednesday in Istanbul upon the initiative of President Zelensky. Russia's usual pattern of response, yet again another record-scale indiscriminate attacks on Ukrainian cities, reveals its true intentions: escalation, not peace. No one wants an end to this war and civilian suffering more than the Ukrainians. Hence, we call on for the international support to a full, unconditional ceasefire, to which Ukraine has already committed, as the first step towards real negotiations. And so far, Russia has been utterly insincere in its offers of a ceasefire, showing that it fears peace more than war. It is up to Russia now to demonstrate genuine readiness to engage to end the war. Finally, a just peace in Ukraine must be based on the UN Charter and international law. Russia's illegal war against Ukraine is a frontal assault on the principles of the UN Charter. Russia's attempt to invoke root causes buys into the false historical narrative and tries to justify Russia's imperial ambitions and idea of multipolar instead of multilateral world. And the Baltic states reaffirm our full support to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. And we will never recognize Ukraine's occupation, neither de jure nor de facto. Mr. President, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is not a regional issue. Its consequences extend far beyond. And we have a collective responsibility to uphold the UN Charter and ensure respect for international law. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.